Hello and welcome to the Observations podcast. I'm Matt Davis, the Special International Elections correspondent. Today, we'll be talking about a country that has some upcoming elections in the South Pacific Ocean. Today, we'll be discussing Samoa. Samoa is an island nation in Polynesia, a part of Oceania. It has a population of roughly 220,000 people. For our UK listeners, that puts it at a similar population size to Portsmouth. Whilst there has been some British involvement in Samoa, perhaps playing a part in its love for rugby, it was never a part of the British Empire. In 1899, it became a German protectorate and remained so until the First World War, after which it was administered by New Zealand until gaining independence in 1962 with the signing of the Treaty of Friendship. So who might you know who's related to Samoa? Well, the Scottish author Robert Louis Stevenson, author of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, among many others, moved to Samoa in 1890 after touring the Pacific Islands, writing some of his last works there, such as The Ebb Tide. In terms of pop culture and sport, there are a few famous people that come from Samoan descent. These include the New Zealand Samoan boxer David Tua and Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. Dwayne Johnson's links to Samoa mean that part of the film Fast and Furious Hobbs and Shaw was set in Samoa, although these scenes were typically filmed in Hawaii. You may even know that rugby union is considered the Samoan national sport, and as a result of this, they've played in every Rugby World Cup since 1991. So what's interesting about Samoa? Well, in 2011, Samoa decided to move the international date line, meaning that they skipped from the 29th of December, 2011, to the 31st of December. This was largely to ease trade with countries such as New Zealand and Australia, as then they were no longer a whole day apart. So Samoa has an election coming up on Friday the 29th of August. And to talk through some of the background to this election and Samoan democracy more broadly, I'm delighted to have a key expert in the field on the podcast with me today. Joining me from the other side of the world, New Zealand, is Dr. Iati Iati, a senior lecturer at Victoria, University of Wellington. He has written on topics including the last Samoan election in 2021 and the extent to which Samoa's institutions can be considered democratic. So to talk through some of the background of this election and Samoan democracy more broadly, I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Iati Iati, a senior lecturer at Victoria, University of Wellington. Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
To start us off, how does the electoral system work? I understand that it's a parliamentary system, but it's not necessarily that similar to how the UK system or New Zealand system even works.
Well, in some ways, it is similar to the Westminster style of democracy, in that we have a legislative assembly. From the legislative assembly, you get cabinet, etc. And also, but instead of the Westminster system, where here in New Zealand you would have the Governor General, who has to sign off on the bills before they become law. In Samoa, we have a head of state. So detached from the Governor General system that we would have here in New Zealand, Cook Islands, Niue, etc. So kind of similar to the Westminster system, but with some differences. The other major difference is that all the members of Parliament have to hold traditional chiefly titles. So if you don't hold a title, you're not eligible to run as a candidate for Parliament. Initially, that wasn't the case. There were 2 seats that were made available for those that did not hold traditional chiefly titles, but that's since been erased, and now every member of Parliament has to have chiefly title to run for Parliament.
Okay, so what role do these, you have this traditional system of governance in Samoa, the matai, with like these matai, these chiefs that manage family affairs and land. What sort of role do they play in the system?
So at independence, Samoa wanted to combine their traditional political system which allowed for a more grassroots democracy. They wanted to combine that with a national political system that would allow them to operate as a nation state. So their system takes the best of the tradition, where democracy is rooted locally within what you would refer to as a polity. Some may refer to it as a village, and taking that and integrating it to the national level institutions. So in some respects, it's sort of like a direct democracy mixed with representative democracy. So for the Samoans, it was a way to make sure that the people, the constituents, had a very close relationship with their representatives.
That's quite an interesting, system to do, and I'd say to have that link to somebody.
Yeah, if I can
Of
expand a little bit on
course,
it. So what it allows is, if there's a member of parliament who is not representing his or her constituencies as they would like, they could always take their chiefly title away. And if that's the only chiefly title that member has, it then makes them ineligible for parliament. So there you can see the very close connection between the constituents and their representatives. And of course, these chiefly titles, they don't have a set tenure with their bestowment. So you could bestow it today and take it away, say, in the next few months. So to always make sure that there's a close connection between the representative and the constituents, which is why I was saying there's this very close direct democracy mixed with sort of the representative democracy.
now to get an idea of the context of this election, I think it's important to note that the previous election was really quite historic. The Human Rights Protection Party had been largely dominant since winning in 1982, right up until its defeat in 2021, when the FAST Party, with FAST being an acronym for Samoans United in Faith, in Samoan, won the election. Could you provide some background as to how the FAST Party won this election, whilst only being formed a year before?
Since 1982, they've effectively been in power until the last election. I say effectively because there was a brief period during 1986 when a coalition government came into power for a few years, but most of that coalition government was from the HRPP anyway, so people tend to take it as the HRPP has been in power since from 1982 until the last election when they lost. At the last election, we saw just before it, we saw the rise of this new party, new in the sense that it was a new political party, but old in the sense that its leaders, many of them were actually former HRPP anyway. So they had a lot of political history and political ties that worked in their favor to come into power. And so it was a landmark election, obviously, since the HRPP has been in power for so long. But in saying that, there were obviously some ties back to the HRPP base.
The result in 2021 was pretty much split evenly in terms of the seats, with the largest two parties. What impacts did this have?
So because they were, I think it was like one seat difference, and then there was a call by the electoral commissioner based on a constitutional provision that required 10% of a minimum of 10% of seats to be held by women. Based on that, his call made it even between both sides, which led to a very drawn out, election process that involved the courts. And eventually, the FAST Party, which won the election. Eventually, they did come into power months later.
Mm-hmm. We'll now stop for a quick break.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, heroes, legends, and absolute icons. The moment you've been waiting for has finally arrived. From the depths of anticipation to the heights of legendary status, this is not just an event, it's a phenomenon. Get ready to witness the unimaginable, to experience the unforgettable, to be part of something bigger than history itself. Strap in, hold on. It's the Observations podcast series on elections that shook the world.
And welcome back. So, moving on to this upcoming election, it seems like it's been a pretty tumultuous year and a pretty tumultuous time in power in general. What are some of the key things that have led to this election being called earlier than expected?
Primarily, it was because of factions that emerged from within the ruling party. And it's a very messy background as to why these factions emerged. It involves court cases, which recently kind of concluded. The final judgment hasn't come out yet, but with that background aside, these factions then basically led to the prime minister having her supporters and the leader of the party, who was not the prime minister, having the majority of supporters from what was the Fast Party. So, what we then had in government was sort of three factions. You had the old party, the HRPP, you had the prime minister's faction, which is the smallest of them, and then you had the leader of the Fast with his own faction, which was the largest. And so, over the last few months, there have been politicking to see whether the leader or the prime minister should step down. That was the position of the Fast Party, that she should step down and relinquish power to them. Obviously, this was not in line with the electoral laws, so she held on to her position. She defeated two votes of no confidence. She won both of them. But then more recently, when they went to pass the budget, she did not succeed on that one. And so I think it was around June the 3rd that she advised the head of state to dissolve parliament.
Okay, so do you think the Human Rights Protection Party have a chance at regaining power in this election?
They're certainly in a strong position. And I say they're in a strong position because we've seen a very sort of messy time in office from the Fast Party. Obviously, a lot of bills that they probably wanted to get passed did not get passed. There was the internal politicking, which spilled out into the broader legislative assembly. So people would have seen that brief period as being in contrast to what was generally perceived to be a long period of stability in Samoan politics. So, in that respect, you'd have to say the HRPP is standing on some pretty solid ground going into the next election.
Does this sort of politicking within parties, given some parties have remained in power for quite long periods of time, is this commonplace in Samoan politics?
Well, not when HRPP was in power. Obviously, that there was a lot of party discipline, which allowed them to stay together up until the last election. But there are always competing, you know, politicians within different parties and even within the HRPP. So obviously those issues were not major enough to cause any splinters or any major factions until the issues that emerged for the last election. But since then, obviously there have been different factions have risen up, and you've had different candidates who now see more opportunity for them to take the reins of power, obviously, with all that's happened over the last few years. So we might expect to see more of that sort of politicking within Parliament than we had previously.
Okay, and do you think that'll take the form of new parties formed? I know that the former prime minister the former leader is entering this election with a new party, or is it more likely to be within parties?
I think there will be more political parties who will try and well, at least test the waters to see if they have enough support to run at the next election. Obviously, with the win by the Fast Party, it signaled to others that the door is now open for them to make a run for Parliament. So in that respect, people are seeing more opportunities than they previously did, because prior to the last election, the election before that, the HRPP won by a huge landslide. So the message, I guess, other people would have got was, we really don't have a chance. But now, with Fast Party having won the last election, and with all these emerging political parties, I think different groups are seeing more opportunities than they previously did have.
Right, yeah, it definitely seems like there's just, in general, a lot more movement within Samoan politics at the moment. Well, thank you very much for joining me today. I really appreciate you coming on. I feel like it's been very informative, and I think, well, I hope our listeners will have learned a lot about how the Samoan system works and a little bit of context about this upcoming election.
I'm glad to help, and yeah, thanks for having me on.
The Observations podcast is being brought to you by Democracy Volunteers, the UK's leading election observation group. Democracy Volunteers is non-partisan and does not necessarily share the opinions of participants in the podcast. It brings the podcast to you to improve knowledge of elections, both national and international.